So the floor is given to our keynote speakers. Their names you can see in the presentation. Dr. Luis Herrera and Dr. Daniel Xeri. Please, let's welcome our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you're having a fantastic presentation. Can you hear me? Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I'm very, very happy to be here with my wonderful colleague, Daniel Sherry. We'll be presenting and talking today about English language teaching in conflict and crisis, centering teachers' well-being. Oh, wonderful to see you all. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. So good to see you. So good to see you.
Hi, good afternoon,
teachers.
everyone.
Oh, Sherry, yes, please go ahead. Daniel Sherry here with us, please. Welcome him as well. Thank you so much. And we'll be talking about ELT in conflict and crisis, centering teachers' well-being, roles, and agency. And we're going to do our best to keep it interactive and keep it as a conversation. Of course, you have there our information as well, so you're welcome to always, come back to us via email or online, and then we'll be glad to continue our conversation. Okay, so one moment. I'm trying to see how to go. Okay, so I've been thinking recently about the role. A lot of my work has been centering on thinking and rethinking about the role of teachers in what I like to call this new reality, which is where we're living right now, our present times, right? So when I'm thinking about teachers and especially in moments of uncertainty, I always or often turn to nature. I live right next to a forest. I'm seeing the forest right here. My entire house is filled with plants. I have plants everywhere. Everywhere I have a space, I have a plant. This is a plant. I don't know if you can see it there. So I always go to nature. But going back to the presentation, as Daniel and I were preparing for this presentation, I kept thinking about an image that kept coming to my mind on how to start the conversation today. And of course, it was the sunflower and sunflowers, a sunflower field, and the sky. We look at the sun, which is what we have here in this visual. And we know that sunflowers, they turn towards the sun because light helps them grow. But besides nutrition, I like to think also that sunflowers also turn towards the sun for guidance or to find their north, right? In classrooms, students often turn towards us, teachers, in a very similar way. They turn towards people that offer warmth, direction. And when we look at context of crisis, of course, students look for individuals who offer routines. I'm going to talk about routines later, that teach them not only language, but language in a way that they can explain and understand the realities. They can use language to explain the realities. And also, students are looking and turning towards individuals who can give them hope in situations and moments of crisis. But we know, and we're teachers, we know this, education is never a one-way relationship, right? Teachers, we do not just simply give and give and give, and students do not simply receive. We don't have that conceptualization anymore. Teaching and learning, we know they're connected, we know they're reciprocal, and we know they're deeply human. We know this. I'm preaching to the choir here. We're teachers. We understand this. We know that what happens to us affects our students, and we know that what happens to our students affects us as well, right? And this is the heart of the work that Daniel and I have been doing in recent times, where a lot of our conversation today is going to come from a special issue that is going to be published soon, and also an edited volume that we're working on. And we're focusing on language education in context of crisis and conflict. And when we look at language teaching, specifically English language teaching, in these contexts, we're looking at it not only through the lens of curriculum, methods, policies, but we're very interested in learning more about the individuals who carry education forward every day, which I feel are teachers, and I call them the infant. I call us the infantry of education. Teachers. We move forward education every day. So in recent times, my work and the work that I'm doing with Daniel begins with a simple idea, which is that a healthy educational system depends on the well-being of both students and teachers. Okay, so if students need light to grow, teachers also need the support to keep shining. This analogy, sunflowers and sun. If students are the sunflowers looking to the sky for guidance and nourishment, then teachers, we are the sun providing direction, continuity, warmth, especially in classrooms where there are contexts that are marked by conflict, by crisis. So our conversation today is going to be guided by this idea that teachers and students are always connected. We support and are affected by each other's realities. So through our conversation, we have divided our conversation in three different parts. We're going to start with teacher well-being, and these are major findings or lessons that we have learned through our work. And our work is ongoing, by the way. This is work that we're doing with teachers around the world, different contexts of crisis, of conflict, in different ways, right? They're experiencing these realities, and we're learning more and more about these teachers. And we're focusing on three elements. Of course, they're non-exhaustive. This is not the only thing that teachers report, but well-being, roles, and agency seem to be among the most important elements that teachers are looking at. All right, so or are experiencing in these contexts. So looking at teacher well-being in context of conflict and crisis. So let me go here. This comes from, and I shared this with Daniel recently. I've been working on this book for 4 years, and I told my co-authors we need to finish it this year because it's been too long. But this is coming from a book that we're talking about teachers and safety and well-being for teachers. But I got this from chapter 1 of that book, and it says, in the process of education, teachers and students are like the infinity sign, always connected, always interacting, always supporting and dependent on one another. The symbiosis between educators and learners is a dynamic that nourishes the intellectual and emotional growth of both. A healthy and successful educational ecosystem thrives on the mutual well-being of teachers and pupils. This is how I see education, as an infinity sign. What happens to one affects the other. Students and teachers, we deserve equal support, equal care, equal protection in the educational systems. Now, I would love to, and I was thinking, by the way, we were thinking that perhaps, I don't know if there is capability of doing this. Maybe if you don't have a microphone, we can come back to this in the Q&A at the end. But some questions that I had here, I would love to hear your thoughts. I got this from a quite outdated book, and I would love to hear your thoughts. The teacher should feel the sacredness of his calling and give himself to it with zeal and devotion. This comes from this book, 1917, almost over 100 years, 110 years now. When we look at this is the idea of education as a profession of sacrifice. Teachers, we have to give ourselves for the profession. We have to give everything that we have for the profession. And I was wondering, do we agree with this statement? Of course, this is over 100 years now old, but what does this statement infer about teacher well-being? Is this statement still applicable to our realities today? So I'm going to leave these questions here. We're gonna give us some time at the end, and then we're gonna come back to these questions. We have a few more questions throughout the conversation, and we're welcome to come back to any of these questions, okay? But some thoughts here for us to think about, because I'm looking at the time as well. All right. let me come. Okay, here we go. So again, this idea of teaching being a sacrificial profession, right? So I wanted to go ahead then and define for us what teacher well-being is. There are many definitions out there. I wanted to keep it nice and simple. Teacher well-being is about having enough emotional, relational, professional, and institutional support is so important to keep teaching humanely and sustainably. What teacher well-being is not just feeling fine, it's not a luxury, and it's not something nice to have. Okay? Teacher well-being is the glue that holds the entire educational system or ecosystem together. And I would love also at the end to hear your thoughts about uh, this idea. Now, what we're learning from our work when it comes to teacher well-being, and again, a lot of the conversations and information that we're going to share with you comes from ongoing work that we're doing with teachers in context of conflict, crisis. Some of the noticeable elements that we're seeing when it comes to teacher well-being in context of crisis is that crisis changes what teachers carry. And we carry a lot, of course. We're teachers. We're the infantry of education, as I like to call it. We're keeping everything moving forward. Care, uncertainty, adaptation, emotion, labor, responsibility. Of course, when it comes to care, we're constantly, that's our job. We're constantly noticing, evaluating, assessing. Even if we don't realize that we're assessing, noticing, we are. It's part of our practice. That's what we're taught to do from day one. So when we're seeing students struggle emotionally, not only academically, but emotionally, they're having some struggles because of war, crisis, conflict. We know that. We carry that with us. Also, uncertainty. We don't know in this context, teachers are not aware, what's going to happen today. Do we have a schedule? There isn't a set schedule. This idea of flexibility comes to mind, resilience. Internet may or may not work some days. We may have to adapt. You may have a lesson plan and then you arrive in the classroom and then something happened. You're like, you know what? Today, let's focus on our own well-being and let's check in. How is everyone doing? Right? Adaptation. This idea again goes hand in hand with uncertainty. For teachers in these contexts, specifically as they become caretakers of their students, as they become spaces and they create spaces where students can come and talk to them and feel that they can just leave for a moment behind what's happening in those contexts, teachers, they start adapting their lessons. Yes, of course, teaching academic context is important, but teachers start modifying or shifting towards more trauma sensitive practices, social emotional learning practices that take care of relational elements. Also, when it comes to emotional labor, for example, where teachers are simultaneously helping students manage their own emotions while they also manage their own emotions. So teachers are simultaneously dealing with emotional labor firsthand and secondhand. Secondhand when it comes to their students. And responsibility, because also teachers are carrying this new change, everything that's happening, usually conflict, crisis, war is not something that you can plan for. So everything is happening simultaneously, everything is new. So teachers, their responsibility or sense of responsibility is changing as it goes, kind of building the airplane mid-flight kind of idea. So what does it look like in practice? And this actually comes from different publications that, again, that we're working with, and individuals, colleagues, friends that we're working with in our projects. But care has become, for most teachers in context of crisis, of conflict, trauma-sensitive practices, practices that connect to social emotional learning aspects. So many of you may be doing this already without realizing. Teachers take on that role. Uncertainty. This comes actually from one of the articles in the special issue, and I worked with a couple of colleagues here, and we explore the reality of teachers after an earthquake, a big earthquake that happened in Morocco a few years back. And this was really an example of uncertainty. Teachers didn't know what to do, didn't know what to expect after the earthquake, but they somehow find ways to continue supporting students. So, uncertainty, this idea of doing the best that you can as a teacher to continue moving forward, teaching but supporting students at the same time, which goes hand in hand with adaptation. This is collaborative autoethnography from three Ukrainian professors and three dear friends that might be here in the audience. I cannot see very well the audience, but they might be here. And they talk about adaptation, Ukrainian multilingual English teachers adapted through hybrid teaching. So, social emotional learning, trauma sensitive pedagogy, professional collaboration. These are some ways on how they adapted to the new reality. Emotional labor. In wartime contexts, of course, teachers, you're exposed to stories of trauma that comes from students, but also your own stories of trauma. So you have to simultaneously balance and deal with first and second hand emotion labor, which may lead to burnout, fatigue. This is something that teachers in these contexts also deal with. And as I'm saying this, all of these things might be things that, of course, you know and recognize firsthand. So this might be something that you already are experiencing. And responsibility, when it comes to responsibilities in these new realities, educational systems, they expect, even if they don't say it, they might give you specific guidelines to teachers. Okay, so this is now what we have to do, or this is what you need to do now to help students. Or they might not, the educational systems and institutions might not say explicitly what they expect from teachers, but teachers take on new roles, new responsibilities to deal with the new reality. Now, some of the things, and again, this comes from the collaborative autoethnography that I mentioned to you earlier, Friedrich et al. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. Some ways that teachers find support, and I'll share this with you. I'm looking at the time as well, so I don't want to go too deep into these, but these are only five. We have many, many more. Small routines, safe boundaries. You have here the table, peer connection, staying connected as much as possible, reducing isolation. That is very important. Flexible pedagogy, realizing that in moments of conflict and crisis, the priority, academics is always important, but the priority is the individual, the student as a human being, the teacher as a human being, and institutional support. Teachers in conflicts, in situations or context of conflicts and crisis, find that institutional support is essential for their well-being, for them to be able to sustainably keep moving forward. Without institutional support is very, very hard. And when I talk about institutions, I'm talking about not only universities, schools. Ukraine TESOL is an institution, an association. So you're finding right now in this conference institutional support. You're founding peer connections. So these are contributing to your well-being as well. Okay. All right. And then from here, I'm gonna hand it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Lewis, and hello, everyone. I apologize in advance if suddenly I'm kicked out of the Zoom meeting room, but I'm currently in Mexico City and have a very poor Wi-Fi connection. But Lewis will be able to take over if that happens. So Lewis was looking at well-being as a very important pillar when we talk about teachers in conflict contexts. Now I'm going to look at teacher roles, and this was actually part of a special issue that Lewis and I co-edited. We looked at how teachers actually take on new roles when they find themselves in contexts of conflict and crisis. And this kind of situation, a situation that is being experienced by you in your own context, but also by teachers in other contexts around the world, makes us think about what it means to be a teacher and how we position ourselves in relation to our learners, in relation to society, in relation to the language that we teach, in relation to our own identity. So that is why we're using the term reconceptualizing here, because these kind of situations really make us rethink what it means to be an educator. And can we go to the next slide, Lewis? And this is a question that I'd like you to reflect upon. You have direct experience of this. Unlike me, I haven't been in a conflict context, but you have immediate experience of this. So, since the start of the war that your country is in, do you feel that your roles as an educator have evolved? And I'm intentionally using the term roles in the plural because we're thinking of multiple roles that we have as educators. Have these roles changed? Have you found yourself questioning what you're doing or whether you need to be doing things differently now that you find yourself in this situation? And you have learners who are also impacted by this conflict. So I'd like you to think about this question, and later at the end of our talk, we'll ask you to contribute ideas. Those of you following us online, you could also share your thoughts in the chat box. So moving on, one of the aspects that we consider when we are reconceptualizing teacher roles in conflict contexts is that we are no longer thinking of a teacher of English as someone who is responsible for merely teaching a subject. So it's not only the instructional role that we are prioritizing, whereas traditionally some institutions, some systems look at teachers as merely people who are transmitting a subject, teaching a language, and they only look at teachers in that narrow kind of perspective. Here, we find ourselves really broadening our understanding of what being an educator means. And Lewis has already touched upon these issues when he talked about, for example, care and how care becomes a very important aspect of what we do. Now, it doesn't mean that we only start caring about our learners, about the learning experiences because of conflict, but in a way, conflict makes this even more pronounced. It makes it more immediate, more urgent for us to think about our role as caregivers. And caregivers not only in relation to our students, but also in relation to the rest of the community that we form part of, or the communities that we form part of, because we form part of a professional community, but then there are other communities that we are part of. So in our work, we examine this idea that our own boundaries as educators, our professional boundaries, these are actually redefined. We start thinking about how we position ourselves as educators, given that we are experiencing conflict or crisis. And we start seeing ourselves as having agency. We always have agency, but we become even more aware of the
I
but it is a kind of agent facets to it. And one very important aspect of this is the educator acting as a vital anchor, a psychosocial anchor. I'm cutting off, right, Lewis, at certain points.
yes, Daniel. We lost you for a moment, but you're back. You're back now.
Okay, great. Um, and if we can move on to the next slide. The other important thing that happens when we start thinking about our role as educators is we start also becoming more aware of how our own identity is being impacted by conflict, by the situations that we find ourselves in. For example, there's a lot of research currently on how the war is impacting educators in Ukraine. And the first point on the slide there talks about this fragmentation of the cohorts of students that you teach and how your own work environment, the work environment that you used to, has been degraded because of conflict. What does that mean for you as educators? What does it mean for your own identity? And Other research conducted in other contexts around the world, conflict-affected contexts, has examined how educators are ultimately balancing multiple roles, whether that is the traditional role of an educator or else now becoming more of an activist, but also acknowledging that you're impacted by the conflict on a personal level, not just on a professional level. So you are also a victim of what is happening. And there is also this idea that the educator is trying to approach the situation from multiple angles. Is it a question of stepping back, feeling as if you're helpless, or actually trying to do something about this, something that we'll talk about later when we talk about agency. So adaptive agency is very important, and this is also something that Lewis touched upon when he was talking about well-being. Moving on, there is also the idea, the notion that as educators, we are also responsible for inspiring hope. Hope in our learners, hope in the communities that we belong to. And there is this paper by Oplatka that talks about how we, as educators, in context-affected contexts, we are also there to manage emotions, our own emotions, the emotions of our colleagues, but also the emotions of our learners. And ultimately, despite all the negativity, despite all the tragic circumstances that we find ourselves in, to project optimism, because that optimism is very important in enabling us to facilitate our students' inner world, the emotional world that they are experiencing. The other aspect that I'd like to focus on, if we can move on to the next slide, Lewis, is what I've already mentioned, the issue that a large part of what you're doing as educators in a conflict context is revolving around the idea of trauma-sensitive teaching. So you are very much aware of the trauma that you are experiencing, the trauma that your colleagues are experiencing, the trauma that your students and the rest of society is experiencing, and you are there having to do something about this. So your very teaching is a means by which you provide that care that your learners and your colleagues require. In one of the papers in our special issue, Sika and her colleagues look at how social emotional activities in the classroom are vital, not only because they enable the learners to continue learning the language, but they are also vital because they prioritize student well-being. So in a way, the classroom becomes a place where our learners find compassion. Compassion being such an important aspect of what we do as educators, but becoming even more important for you as educators in a conflict affected context. And if you'd like to learn more about compassion, I highly recommend Sarah Mercer's book on compassion in English language teaching. This also means that given the importance of trauma-sensitive pedagogy, we need to make this an important aspect of pre-service teacher education, so as to prepare teachers for situations that might require such a kind of pedagogy. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And the next point is about how, despite the fact that sometimes we might feel unappreciated by society, by institutions, by systems, ultimately educators are community linchpins. They are crucial to not only the survival of a society, but to it thriving. and doing well. And in context of conflict, this becomes even more important. In fact, there's research showing that sometimes when a society transitions into a post-conflict phase, educators are the ones who start rebuilding institutions, who start actually providing the stability necessary for a society to thrive and to prosper. So what we're seeing here is that educators are very important pillars for society, but at the same time, we sometimes forget how vulnerable they are, how impacted by trauma, by hardship, by violence they sometimes are. Being very positive about your identity and about your role is crucial. But at the same time, we also need to remember, especially those of us who have power, we also need to remember that we shouldn't just take it for granted that educators will just keep doing this without the necessary support, especially institutional support. So institutional support is necessary for teachers in order for them to keep playing such an important role, not only in the classroom or in the school, but in society itself. And then the next point that I'd like to focus on is about how sometimes in the classroom, in the very act of teaching the language, we're also helping our learners think about the other. In certain cases, this might be the enemy or the opponent of our own country, the country that is in conflict. And one paper that I'd like to refer to here is the paper by Bridget Sfars and Daphna Itzhaki in our special issue, which shows how English can be used as a language to mediate intercultural dialogue between two communities at war. And that was a paper about the Israeli and Palestinian context. The other important point here is that despite the fact that we might have this drive towards peace and peace building, pacification, we have to understand that teachers within their own classroom are also engaging in this. And this is what I'm referring to here as the messy grassroots peace building that you are responsible for, also in enabling your learners to think about language and how language operates on a social level. Lewis?
Yes, you froze for a moment, but you're back, Daniel. You're back. We have you back.
Yeah. So the next point that I'd like to focus on, the next slide. Can we have the next slide, Lewis?
Yes, did it change already?
No, I'm not seeing it. Yeah. So this is also something that has become highly pronounced in your context in particular. This is how, in a way, you're not just teaching a language, but you're also enabling your learners to be critical consumers of the media, especially of the language used by the media. And this means that you are helping your learners to question propaganda, to question conflicting messages presented to them by different factions, by different voices. So, in a way, you're using language teaching as a means of enabling your learners to be more reflective about how language itself can sometimes be misused or abused by those powers that are trying to influence the way people think. And this takes us to agency. And agency is the third pillar of this presentation. I've already mentioned that we all have agency as educators, but in times of conflict, we become even more aware of our agency and what that agency actually means. I'm going to provide you with a definition of agency on the next slide and a question for you to think about your agency. Let me give you some time to read through this definition. Now, this is just one definition of agency, but I'd like you to use it as a means of reflecting on what agency means for you, especially now in times of conflict and crisis. And the first point that I'd like to make about agency before handing back to Lewis is about how agency is something that um, makes us think about what we're doing in terms of our pedagogy and about the decisions that we take in times of crisis. So, in crisis responsive education, what we see happening is that teachers take a highly active role in terms of redesigning the teaching and the students' learning experiences using their own professional judgment. So that adaptability that Lewis was referring to earlier becomes even more pronounced in times of conflict because you really need to exercise that in order to ensure that your learners are still getting the best kind of learning experience that they deserve, despite the context that you and them are in. The other point when we speak about agency is that we shouldn't think of it as requiring a heroic stance. It doesn't mean that we need to engage in grand gestures of heroism as teachers, even if we feel that we might need to become activists. At the same time, agency is multifaceted, is a very complex notion, and it can take different forms. Let me now hand over to Lewis, who will continue talking about agency.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, so continuing the conversation on agency, and everyone, all the questions that we have, we're going to come back to them because we want to make this more of a conversation. So we would love to hear from you, and we're going to come back to those questions, okay? So don't worry, I know we had a lot of questions here, but we'll come back to them. So when we talk about now we're going into agency, and Daniel introduced us to the concept of agency. We have to remember also that agency, building from Daniel's last point here, that it doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It doesn't have to be, going back to my initial point of, we don't have to sacrifice ourselves as teachers. We don't have to be giving ourselves so much that we burn out. That's not, when we're thinking about agency, that's not what it means. It doesn't have to be something that we do by ourselves. It doesn't have to be something that we have to sacrifice our personal or professional well-being. Agency can be it's not a solitary trait, which is the first point here. It could be, and it should be, protected by institutional frameworks. We should receive, and this is something that some of us are speaking in the field, this idea of responsible well-being when it comes to agency. We should be giving teachers and educators the framework, the space, the resources to be able to engage in agency for their students, right? Also, when it comes to, specifically when it comes to agency, it can also be, I'm going to skip some of the points here looking at the time because I want to hear from you. We have to make sure that when we are in specific spaces where agency may not be necessarily safe, we can perform acts of agency in a way that is a little bit more invisible, or perhaps that is more silent, and is enacted very strategically through different networks, right? So if, from my understanding, this might not be the case in Ukraine, but again, in other contexts where teachers and teacher agency may not be well looked upon or well received, then teachers may have to take a different approach. It couldn't be something that they do overtly. It could be something that they do more on the background and without a lot of visibility. Now, this takes us into the topic of the limits of agency. And because we're teachers who are often and we tend to prioritize student well-being and student success, and we prioritize our students above all. Sometimes we forget about the risks that come with our own agency. And we have to balance at times, and this is easier said than done, I understand. But if the risks are too high, educators at times they may choose to not engage in agency, and or if they do, that might come with a cost, right? So we have to, depending on our context, this might be something for us to also think about in your particular context. What might be the limits of your own agency when you engage in agency, however agency looks like. We're going to hear from you soon about how agency looks like in your context. But what are the limits, right? Is it something that, for example, it could be burnout, it could be institutional limits that are preventing you from engaging in agency. It might be systemic barriers, it might be other barriers. So what are limits to your agency in your context? This is something that we should be able to consistently think about. For example, in number two, this actually comes from our special issue, Ali Basarati, and he talks about he engaged in an autoethnography, and I'm trying to remember his piece, but he engaged in autoethnographic work, sharing his own experiences. He's an educator from Iran, and then he left Iran, and now he's living here in Poland. And he talked about how he's because of institutional rigidity, it was a rigid institutional framework that they had back in Iran, and also he experienced trauma over there in his context in Iran. He was forced to, or pushed, he said pushed, that's the word that he used, towards becoming more of a quiet teacher, more conservative in his actions. So his agency was highly diminished because of the institutional framework around agency. Teachers were not given a lot of power to enact agency. That's just one example. So at this point, and we're getting close to, because we wanted to do about 20 minutes of conversation with you. Some of the questions that we would like to invite you for thought, and here we would open for Q&A. How important is teacher well-being in ELT since the start of the war? These are some of the questions that we had earlier. Do you feel your roles as a teacher have evolved? How does agency look like for you in your daily practice? But, before we open up very quickly, the 3 points of teacher well-being, roles, and agency. This is something that, again, we see again and again in the work that we're doing in context with teachers, in context of crisis and conflict. And they're usually interconnected. There isn't roles, responsibilities, roles, agency, well-being. One always influences the other in our own practice. I would love to invite you to also perhaps think about, and you're welcome to reflect with us about this particular roles, teacher well-being, your roles, your agency. How is that shifting? Or if you even consider how these three elements are shifting in addition to these questions that we have. We would love to hear from you and your thoughts, okay? But we're going to stop here at this point and just invite you for Q&A and any follow-up questions that you may have about our presentation, our conversation today. Thank you very much. I hope you found it helpful, innovative, and it brought some clarity into this topic. Thank you so much. We would love to hear from you if you would like to share your questions, your comments. We're glad to go back to any slides as well. So we wanted to give a lot of time to talk to you. Any questions? You're muted if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Louis, maybe we could go back to the previous slide so that people have
Oh,
the
yes,
questions
the
and they
questions.
can.
Thank you.
Please, can you hear me well? Yeah. We don't have any questions actually, and
We left everyone speechless. Wow.
can you have them? So, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and for all the food for thought that you have given. That's it. The microphone, maybe people would like to, they're speechless. They
You're welcome to share. And you know, another point.
have one participant who does have a question. Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so she's coming. There are two questions. Okay. They will be brief.
Ні, краще сюди ось говоріть.
There.
Hi, Daniel and Luis. Okay, I just have a simple question, but at the same time, it's complicated. So you said about this okay, sorry. I have a question about maintaining this positive self-image, or I don't remember the term that you use, this positive. Sorry, can you maybe find it on this slide, but, do you know what I mean?
I think it was part 2, right?
So basically, teachers need to feel good about themselves in order to like survive all the chaos and that's going on. But any practical advice about this? Sorry, where to look? Here.
Start drinking.
Yeah, I think it was the point about having a positive self-perception. That is, and I think what the research is indicating here is that we might need to also be very, very positive about ourselves, to engage in positive affirmations about our role and the significance of our role. We already know that we're very important for society, for people, for future generations. But in times of conflict, perhaps we become even more important because we're not just teaching a language, we're not just responsible for a subject, but we're also responsible for ensuring that our learners are able to deal with something that is highly traumatic. They are already perhaps getting that kind of support elsewhere. Perhaps they're getting it from their family, their friends, but they sometimes look to us as individuals who need to provide them with that kind of care and that kind of sensitivity to the negative experiences that they're going through. This means that we need to also recognize and acknowledge how important we are in their lives and in the inner emotional lives that they are currently experiencing. So I think the point is about being positive about ourselves as well and acknowledging the significance of our role in times of conflict.
And building from that, if I may, Daniel, in Ukraine right now, there is a lot of work being done on social emotional learning, on trauma sensitive practices, especially for language teachers, which I'm very happy to see teachers take on that role. And a lot of the work is building around the idea, and I think this is where teachers find empowerment, because to have a positive self-perception, you have to have a sense of empowerment as well. And it goes with what Daniel is saying about the importance of language, the role of language and language education, and the impact that we have on students. There is two examples come to mind. This one is going to be, actually both of them are going to be coming out soon. So one comes from Petrenko, Serhi. I don't know if Serhi's here. And he wrote a chapter where he is proposing a social emotional learning framework. One of them, one of the elements, one of the pillars comes from coming from his social emotional learning framework. It's this sense of moving forward. And I forgot the specific word that he used, but that comes with teacher empowerment as well. Another example, especially about the role of language education in Ukraine, which also comes from social emotional learning, comes from Ala Friedrich and Małgorzata Durin. And there were another chapter. And here we see the role of teachers about empowering students. And again, this is the idea about language education as a source of empowerment. And they did a virtual collaboration where students are looking into the future of Ukraine after the war, rebuilding Ukraine. So this is the power that language education has, and this is how teachers can find empowerment, looking Ukraine after the war. Said he also talked about that, about the social emotional learning framework that he proposes after the war, rebuilding Ukraine. So that's the empowerment element that teachers need to find to be able to also share that with their students. Did I go on a tangent here, or does that answer your question?
Yeah, answer.
Yeah.
Не провокуй,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question
So
there.
much.
Yes.
So, thank you very much for your presentation. And my colleagues too. I want to ask you about what does it mean agency in your point while teaching foreign language, and what is the purpose of the agency and principles? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much. There was a little bit of echo. Can you repeat that for us, please?
What does it mean agency in your point of view, especially while teaching foreign languages?
Agency from our point of view, specifically teaching foreign languages, correct?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Because there is some echo there. Daniel, would you like to start? Would you like me to start?
Yeah.
No, go ahead, go ahead. Perhaps we can also go back to the definition that we provided of agency, which
For
is
me,
just one definition.
yes, and for me, agency is everything that we do. Teachers, they don't have to be, again, big, grand actions or acts. Everything that we do is agency. That's how I see it. Everything that we do as teachers, even when we are in contexts where, going back to that paper from Ali Basarati, where his institutional the institutional practices in Iran didn't allow him to take action, just choosing to become quieter or less or more conservative in his actions, more kind of taking a step back, that's agency as well, because he's engaging in self-preservation. So agency could also be self-preservation, and whether in your institutions, we're working with colleagues that right now they're experiencing, not necessarily in conflict, in context of conflicts or crisis, but just in institutions that are not supporting their well-being, that are actually affecting their well-being. They're taking actions to preserve their own well-being. That's agency as well, right? So it could be taking actions for students, for ourselves. Everything we do, I see it as agency.
And agency is also very personal. It's your personal way of thinking about your own role and how you're enacting your agency in the classroom. Your question was also about in the context of teaching foreign languages. And that's what we're trying to do by means of this talk, but also by means of the publications that we're referring to. Try to broaden your understanding of agency, try to broaden your own understanding of what you're doing as an educator, because that might not only be helpful for you in this particular context, but it is definitely vital for your own learners. And perhaps your learners require more from you, require more from your own understanding of agency than merely seeing yourself as someone who is responsible for teaching a language. And that's it.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That was a point that I didn't address, so thank you for that. Yes, see, when I talk to my students, especially language education, of course, I'm a language teacher, so I see everything through the lens of language. And I think we think in language, we act in language. Everything we do is language. Language is not only spoken, by the way, nonverbal communication. Everything is language. I see the world as language, right? So that's what I always tell my students. language education, the importance of language education is that everything, society is language, is communication. We have language because we need it for society, and societies exist because of language. So that's the power of language and language education. Specifically, English language teaching is the lingua franca of the world. So we're helping our students, especially in Ukraine. There is this edited volume that Florida. Florida TESOL, they did a fantastic job, and they brought a lot of teachers from Ukraine. If you haven't seen it, check it out. A lot of stories, and that's more than anything a perfect example of the power of English in English language education, in historicizing, making a history. A document that records history of English teachers in Ukraine right now. And I've been talking to a lot of my friends in Ukraine, teachers, and I keep telling them, please record your histories. This is history that is happening right now. And what a better way to do that with English, the lingua franca of the world. That's what our students can do as well, especially students that you're working with, sharing their histories, their realities, their stories as documentation of real life history that is happening right now through English, because again, the lingua franca of the world, it has more reach in social media, in publications, everywhere. I hope that answers your question.
I'm grateful for your answer.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking talk, and we will continue discussing the problems of English language teaching and well-being of teachers during the coming 2 years of our discussions. Thank you for making such a good start for our thoughts and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to be here. I keep telling my friends that I hope to be in Ukraine very, very soon, in a free and stable and happy, thriving Ukraine very, very soon. Thank you so much for the invitation once again.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.